Imagine upending centuries of entrenched scientific dogma, entirely redefining what it means to be human, and basically kicking off a 60-year career as the world's most famous scientist.
Right.
Now imagine doing all of that with absolutely zero formal scientific training, like nothing but a notebook and a childhood stuffed animal named Jubilee.
It is wild.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at the legacy of Dame Jane Goodall, especially following her recent passing on October 1st, 2025, at the age of 91. We really want to figure out how a single individual completely dismantled the boundary between humans and, the rest of the animal kingdom.
Yeah, and that detail you mentioned about the stuffed animal, it isn't just some quirky anecdote. It's actually the genesis of her entire worldview.
Really? Just the toy?
Yeah, her father gave her that toy chimpanzee, Jubilee, when she was little, much to the horror of her mother's friends, by the way, who thought it would give the poor girl nightmares.
Oh.
Right. But instead, it sparked this lifelong fascination. But the truly remarkable thing here isn't just that she loved animals. It's that her complete lack of formal scientific training, which, should have been an insurmountable barrier.
Oh, absolutely.
Was the exact lens that allowed her to see what the scientific establishment of the mid-20th century was entirely blind to.
Okay, let's unpack this, because her path to the jungle defies literally every conventional career trajectory.
Yeah.
Like, put yourself in her shoes for a second. It's 1957.
Right.
You are a young woman, you love animals, so you scrape together some money and travel to Kenya to visit a friend's farm.
Just a completely different world back then.
Totally. And once there, someone suggests you should talk to Louis Leakey. And he is already a world-famous paleontologist and archaeologist.
He's a giant in the field.
Exactly. And you have no degree, no background in biology, but you just call him up to chat about animals. And he hires you as his secretary.
It sounds absurd until you understand what Leakey was actually trying to accomplish. He was a visionary, and he was operating with a very specific hidden agenda.
A hidden agenda.
Yeah. He firmly believed that the study of existing great apes could provide vital clues to the behavior of early hominids, our human ancestors.
Oh,
So he was actively hunting for someone to go into the wild and observe chimpanzees. But he deliberately kept that idea to himself when he first hired her, sending her off to dig for fossils at Olduvai Gorge first.
Like a test run.
Basically. And then by 1960, he finally orchestrated sending her to the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania to study the chimps.
Wait, but why send a secretary? I mean, if he's this prestigious scientist, why not send a trained biologist from Oxford or Cambridge?
Because the trained biologists of the 1950s they were heavily indoctrinated in behaviorism.
Oh, right, B.F. Skinner and all that.
Exactly. This was an era where animals were viewed essentially as biological machines. Stimulus goes in, response comes out. Leakey knew that a formally trained scientist would just march into the jungle and look for behaviors that confirmed the rigid rules they had already been taught.
So they would just see what they wanted to see.
Precisely. He wanted a completely blank slate. He wanted someone who would just sit in the dirt and observe without any preconceived academic baggage.
So getting someone without a degree wasn't an accident at all. It was the strategy.
Exactly.
It's almost like walking into a NASA facility to apply for a secretarial job and ending up commanding the space shuttle. Leakey didn't want someone who knew the quote-unquote rules of animal behavior, because he suspected the rules were just entirely wrong.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, though it wasn't exactly a smooth deployment.
Yeah.
The societal norms of 1960 presented this rather unique logistical hurdle.
Oh, right, because primatology was intensely male-dominated.
Intensely, and field research in general.
Which leads to my absolute favorite detail about her initial deployment. Imagine you, the listener, heading off into the deep African wilderness in your 20s to study wild, potentially dangerous apes. And you have to bring your mom.
It's so funny.
The chief warden of the park, David Anstey, flat out refused to let a young woman live in the Gombe wilderness alone. For safety reasons, he required a chaperone. So her mother, Margaret, packs up, goes with her.
And by all accounts, her mother's presence was vital. The first few months were incredibly demoralizing. I mean, the chimpanzees would flee the moment they saw her.
Right, they had no idea what to make of her.
Exactly. It was Margaret who kept her spirits up, pointing out that even though the chimps were running away, Jane was, getting closer to them each week.
And that persistence eventually pays off, leading to one of the most unprecedented academic jumps in history. In 1962, Leakey arranges for her to go to Cambridge University to pursue a PhD in ethology.
Which is the scientific study of animal behavior?
Right. And she is going for a doctorate without ever having earned a bachelor's degree. She was only the 8th person in the entire history of Cambridge to be allowed to do that.
But that arrival at Cambridge is exactly where the friction between her blank slate observation and the rigid scientific establishment just ignites.
Because she didn't know the rules.
Right. And because she didn't know the rules of physiology, she had already broken all of them in the field.
Specifically the rule about objectivity. I mean, she refused to view the chimpanzees as unfeeling objects. She gave them names.
What's fascinating here is the sheer outrage that caused. The nearly universal scientific practice at the time was to assign subjects numbers?
Just numbers.
Yeah, numbering was considered vital to prevent emotional attachment. It maintained strict clinical objectivity. You know, you don't get attached to subject 42.
Right.
But she was out there writing dispatches about David Greybeard, the first gray-chinned male who warmed up to her.
I love that name.
It's great. She wrote about Goliath, the bold alpha male, and Mike, the cunning strategist, and Flo, the high-ranking mother with her whole family, Figgin, Fabian, Freud, Fifi, and Flint.
It sounds like a neighborhood block party, not a sterile scientific study. But wait, wasn't that considered a massive scientific liability? I mean, she was openly using words like childhood, motivation, and mood.
Oh, her peers were highly critical. She was accused of the absolute worst of ethological sins, anthropomorphism.
Which is projecting human traits onto animals.
Yes, the ascription of human characteristics to non-human animals. The establishment thought she was just a naive amateur projecting her own human emotions onto wild animals. But her refusal to be emotionally detached was the exact mechanism that allowed her to make her breakthroughs.
Because she actually cared about them as individuals.
Precisely. Because she recognized them as complex individuals, she was able to track long-term social dynamics that a clinical observer who was just, rotating through subjects would completely miss.
She just sat there, day after day, until they ignored her presence, which allowed her to see the emotional lives they were hiding. I mean, she documented them hugging, kissing, patting each other on the back, even tickling each other.
Yeah, real affection.
These weren't just stimulus response actions. She was proving they had close, supportive bonds that persisted across a 50-year lifespan.
Which fundamentally threatened the dividing line between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom. But the ultimate death blow to that dividing line came through her observations of a specific behavior involving David Greybeard.
Oh, the tool making.
Yes.
At the time, the defining characteristic of humanity, like the thing that separated us from the beasts, was that we were man the tool maker. But she watched David Greybeard take a twig, deliberately strip the leaves off it, and stick it into a termite mound to fish out the insects.
Right. He didn't just find a tool. He modified an object for a specific purpose.
The intentionality of stripping the leaves is the key distinction there.
It is. That single observation shattered the scientific dogma of the day. When she reported this back to Leakey, his response became legendary. He said, "We must now redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as human."
It's an incredible triumph. But this intense, up-close observation style, this deep emotional attachment she formed, meant she didn't just get to witness their capacity for love and ingenuity. She was also forced to witness something deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
Because for the first decade of her research, she genuinely believed that chimpanzees were, in her own words, rather nicer than human beings. Like she thought they were peaceful vegetarian foragers. Until they weren't.
The shattering of that idealized view represents another major paradigm shift. Because they were not just peaceful vegetarians, she began to document chimpanzees systematically hunting and eating smaller primates, specifically colobus monkeys.
And it wasn't just opportunistic scavenging, right? They were using military-like tactics.
Very coordinated.
They would single out a monkey in the canopy, coordinate to block all the escape routes, make the kill, and then share the meat.
Mm-hmm.
They were wiping out up to a third of the colobus monkey population in the park every single year.
It completely dismantled the idea of the peaceful ape. But the brutality extended inward, too, into their own social structures.
Really?
Oh, yeah. She witnessed dominant females deliberately killing the infants of other females to maintain social dominance. In some cases, this escalated into cannibalism.
Good Lord.
And it culminated in the infamous Gombe chimpanzee war, which lasted from 1974 to 1978.
An actual war.
Yes, this wasn't just a squabble over food. It was actual, organized, protracted warfare between two fractured social groups. One group systematically hunted down and killed the males of the splinter group over the course of 4 years.
Wow. Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because you have to ask how she was able to observe all this so closely. In the early days, to get these incredibly skittish animals to stick around long enough to be studied, she set up artificial feeding stations.
She essentially gave them bananas.
Right. But in 1991, a researcher named Margaret Power published a massive critique of this method. Power argued that Goodall's bananas didn't just help her observe the chimps. The bananas actually altered their behavior and caused the warfare.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of observational science, it touches on a fundamental anxiety: does the observer alter the observed? Margaret Power's critique wasn't just a simple complaint about feeding them. Her argument was ecological.
Okay.
By creating a centralized, high-calorie food source, Goodall artificially compressed the chimpanzee's territory. Chimps that normally would forage miles apart in small, fluid groups were suddenly forced into a tiny, high-stress proximity to compete for this unnatural food source.
Wait, so the accusation is that Goodall accidentally engineered a territorial crisis, that the warfare she witnessed wasn't natural chimpanzee behavior, but like the primate equivalent of a prison riot caused by severe overcrowding around a banana box.
That was Power's argument, yes. She suggested that the extreme aggression and intergroup conflict were artifacts of the provisioning system, just distortions of their normal behavior.
That is a heavy accusation aimed right at the foundation of Goodall's methodology. How do you even defend against that? Did the feeding stations invalidate the data?
Well, Goodall did not shy away from the critique. She acknowledged that the artificial feeding stations definitely contributed to aggression within and between the groups. It absolutely increased tension.
Right, that makes sense.
However, she maintained a vital distinction. She argued that the feeding altered the intensity and frequency of the conflict, but not the nature of it. The capacity for organized warfare was inherent to the chimpanzee. The bananas merely acted as a catalyst.
And other researchers eventually backed her up, right? Like Craig Stanford pointed out, a harsh logistical reality without provisioning. Habituating wild chimpanzees in a dense jungle takes years, sometimes decades.
It's nearly impossible.
Right. Without bringing them into a central location, researchers have an incredibly difficult time viewing any complex social behavior at all, let alone catching rare events like intergroup warfare. You just can't track them through the brush well enough. Plus, later studies of completely unprovisioned chimpanzee groups in other regions eventually showed similar patterns of lethal aggression and territorial warfare.
They did. The behavior is inherent. Though years later, Goodall herself admitted she would not use feeding stations if she were starting over today.
Really?
Yeah, not just because of the behavioral debate, but because we now understand that drawing apes and humans into close proximity exposes the apes to human infectious diseases, which can just decimate wild populations.
It's a classic case of learning as you go. The pioneers take the arrows.
Absolutely.
But you have to imagine the massive cognitive dissonance of her life at this point. By day, she is documenting brutal ape warfare and defending her methodology against the global scientific community. And by night, she is dealing with her own intensely personal, very human quirks. Because the greatest primate observer in human history had a condition that makes her career seem biologically impossible.
You are referring to her prosopagnosia.
Wait, hold on. She had face blindness. How do you spend 60 years documenting the subtle, highly complex social dynamics of hundreds of individual apes if your brain literally cannot process and recognize facial features?
It is a remarkable paradox, but it actually forced a deeper level of observation. Because she couldn't rely on the quick shorthand of facial recognition, she trained herself to recognize the chimpanzees by their gait, their posture, their unique vocalizations, and their overall physical presence.
That is incredible.
She had to observe the whole animal, not just the face. But she did admit it caused her a lot of social anxiety in human settings, as she frequently failed to recognize familiar people, sometimes even confusing people with one another.
Which might explain another wildly counterintuitive fact about her. You would assume the woman who dedicated her entire existence to chimpanzees would consider them her favorite animal.
You would assume that, but she explicitly stated her favorite animal was actually the dog. Yeah, she appreciated the unconditional companionship dogs offered, which, given the brutal chimpanzee politics she observed, makes a certain amount of sense.
It really does. And her curiosity wasn't strictly limited to documented science either. She was openly fascinated by and hoped for the existence of Bigfoot or the Sasquatch.
Yes.
She talked about it in interviews, admitting that she had read all the accounts, even though she knew it was highly improbable since no authentic hide or hair had ever been found. She loved the idea that there were still massive mysteries left in the world.
That really speaks to her enduring sense of wonder. She consistently resisted being boxed in by strict materialist scientific views.
Right.
That openness extended heavily into her spirituality, too. In her book, Reason for Hope, she described having a profound mystical experience at Notre Dame Cathedral. It crystallized her belief in what she termed an anti-chance guiding power in the universe.
That's beautiful.
It is. She found absolutely no contradiction between the brutal mechanics of evolution she observed in the jungle and a belief in a greater spiritual meaning.
I love that about her. She was brilliant, but she wasn't some infallible, rigid machine. She was deeply human and prone to human errors. Take the 2013 controversy.
Oh, the book.
Yeah, she co-authored a book called Seeds of Hope about the role of plants. Right before it went to print, a reviewer pointed out that several sections were completely unattributed. They were copied from Wikipedia, organic tea websites, and, incredibly, an amateurish astrology site.
The plagiarism accusations forced the publisher to entirely delay the release of the book. It was a huge deal.
But she didn't hide from it. She owned up to it immediately, apologized, delayed the publication, and added 57 pages of endnotes. And her excuse, she blamed it on her chaotic note-taking. I think there's something deeply comforting for you, the listener, to know that a pioneer who literally redefined humanity still struggles with chaotic note-taking.
It humanizes her immensely, as does her legendary sense of humor, perfectly encapsulated by the Gary Larson incident.
Oh, this is the best pop culture collision ever. In 1987, Gary Larson, the creator of The Far Side, publishes a comic strip. It shows two chimpanzees grooming each other. One finds a blonde hair on the other and says, "Conducting a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp."
The reaction from her team was swift and severe. The Jane Goodall Institute's lawyers drafted a cease and desist letter calling the comic an atrocity and demanding it be pulled.
But Goodall herself was away in Africa at the time. When she finally saw the comic, she didn't think it was an atrocity. She thought it was hilarious.
She loved it.
She actually called it her absolute favorite depiction of herself in pop culture. She stepped in, stopped the lawyers, wrote the preface to a later Far Side Gallery book, and even invited Gary Larson to visit her research facility in Gombe.
Where, in a twist of perfect comedic timing, Larson was promptly attacked and roughed up by an aggressively territorial chimpanzee named Frodo.
You literally cannot write a better punchline than that. But as much as she appreciated a good laugh, her deep connection to the natural world inevitably pushed her out of the jungle and onto the global stage. There comes a point where you can't just be an observer anymore.
The tipping point for her was a specific conference in Chicago in 1986, the Understanding Chimpanzees Conference.
Okay.
She went to that conference as a researcher, presenting her data. She left that conference as a global activist. Listening to the presentations on habitat destruction, poaching, and the horrific conditions of chimps in medical research labs, she realized that quiet observation was no longer morally sufficient.
She hit the road and basically never stopped. She began traveling nearly 300 days a year. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute to support the Gombe research, but quickly expanded it to global habitat protection.
Right.
She started Roots and Shoots, a youth empowerment program that began with just 12 teenagers on her back porch in Tanzania and exploded to over 10,000 groups worldwide.
And her advocacy broadened far beyond chimpanzees. She campaigned vigorously against factory farming, animal testing, and the use of animals in entertainment.
She was everywhere.
She was. She directly pressured corporations, famously writing to Air France executives, demanding they stop transporting lab monkeys, calling the practice incredibly cruel.
She walked the walk, too. She became a vegetarian and eventually a vegan, publishing a cookbook called Eat Meat Less. She partnered with NASA, using their satellite imagery to track and combat deforestation. She even threw her weight behind the movement to make ecocide, the mass, systemic destruction of nature, a recognized international crime.
This raises an important question, though. How do you effectively translate localized niche scientific research into a massive, effective global movement? Goodall realized something that many conservationists of her era missed. You cannot save animals by ignoring the humans who live next to them.
Exactly. That's the brilliance of her To Care project, Take Care. She didn't just walk into villages in Tanzania and say, "Stop cutting down the trees. The chimps need them." The mechanism of her conservation was community empowerment.
Yeah.
The project focused on reforesting the hillsides, sure, but it did so while simultaneously educating neighboring communities on sustainable agriculture. And crucially, the program provided local girls with access to reproductive health education and college scholarships. She understood that alleviating human poverty and educating women was the most effective way to protect the chimpanzee habitat.
It was a profoundly holistic approach, recognizing the interconnectedness of human and animal welfare. And she maintained that relentless pace of advocacy right up until the very end. She passed away in her sleep of cardiac arrest on October 1st, 2025, at the age of 91.
So recently.
And remarkably, she was still out on a speaking tour in the United States when it happened.
Passing away exactly 45 years to the day after her second husband, Derek Bryson. The global response really highlights the scale of her impact. There were immediate tributes from figures across every spectrum. Prince Harry and Meghan, Al Gore, Justin Trudeau, Leonardo DiCaprio, the UN Secretary General.
Everyone.
Netflix released her final, poignant interview in their famous Last Words series. PETA posthumously named her their Person of the Year for her lifelong legacy of kindness.
She left behind a world that recognized her not just as a scientist, but as a moral force. Her influence was validated at the highest institutional levels. I mean, she was awarded the Kyoto Prize, the Templeton Prize. She was named a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire and received the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom.
So what does this all mean? If we look back at the scope of this deep dive, we started with a young woman carrying a stuffed toy chimp, Jubilee. She walks into the jungle with no training, completely ignores the dogmatic rules of the scientific establishment, and through sheer, patient observation, forces humanity to redefine its place in the world. She then evolves into a tireless global advocate who spent her life proving that we are not separate from the natural world, but deeply, inextricably bound to it.
It leaves us with a profound paradox to consider. Traditional science, especially in the rigid era when she began, demanded cold, objective distance. You numbered your subjects, you suppressed your emotions.
Right.
But Jane Goodall's entire legacy, the very foundation of the discoveries that changed the world, was built on a profound, unapologetic emotional attachment. It makes you wonder is true, deep understanding of any subject even possible without first allowing yourself to care about it.
That is a fascinating question to carry with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep observing, and we will see you next time.